Hi there. So this is part 6 of the immune system lecture series. So we want to talk about continued surveillance of these pathogens that we have encountered and the difference between a primary immune response and a secondary immune response. The secondary immune response is, of course, much more effective because it is a pathogen that our body has already prepared to deal with for. So those memory B cells and memory T cells can be very useful in subsequent exposures to that same pathogen. So our primary immune response occurs when our bodies first encounter that particular antigen. And in this case, our antibody concentration rises relatively slowly because our body has to have time to divide those B cells and T cells and make those to make that immune response happen. In our secondary response, we already have those memory B cells and memory T cells that, when activated, can really divide much more effectively, creating those plasma cells again that are short-lived for both types of lymphocytes and causing a much stronger and longer lasting response to that old pathogen. So here you can see a chart with your primary response up here and the level of antibody in the bloodstream from that primary response versus a secondary response when we encounter that old pathogen. So it's quite significant, the ability of our immune system to be boosted by those memory cells that have already encountered that pathogen the first time. Another interesting thing is, because we know that B cells and T cells develop immunocompetency before they encounter these different antigens, we know that all these different types of antibodies that are on B cells, for instance, that those proteins are coded for in our genes. So it is because of the genes that we have all of these different types of antibodies that would be membrane-bound antibodies on our B cells coded for. So after that infection is dealt with, and we then can go on and we have withdrawing of forces. So we have the engulfing antigen-bearing particles, the dendritic cells, the macrophages migrating to the lymph nodes where T cells bind and cause that immune response. So during an infection, that's why our lymph nodes swell, due to the accumulation of all of these white blood cells that have been activated and switched into high gear to deal with that infection. So these antibody antigen complexes can be bound by complement, are cleared out by the liver and the spleen in our excretory system. There are also another type of T cell that I'd like to mention briefly here. These are called suppressor T cells. So these suppressor T cells turn off the immune response when the antigen is no longer a threat in our body. So let's talk about some types of immunity here. We have active immunity and we have passive immunity that I'd like to discuss. So active immunity is when our body has produced those memory B cells and T cells following the exposure to the pathogen, so that particular antigen. And this occurs naturally whenever a person gets an infection, but it can also occur through a vaccination process. So a vaccine is typically an enabled or dead version of that particular pathogen, or a deactivated version of that particular pathogen. Some vaccines, but it's more rare, are a weakened version of that particular pathogen. But in active immunity, when we are exposed to a particular pathogen, we develop those memory B cells and T cells following the exposure to the antigen. So it doesn't matter whether we get that exposure through artificial means, like through a vaccination, or naturally bump into that antigen, our body is still going to form those memory B cells and T cells, and we can have that active immunity. So vaccinations are a very important part of developing immunity for our population, for our species, to be able to fight disease. Vaccinations can cause no noticeable symptoms to happen, and a much lesser form of that infection to happen. And so it prepares our immune system to be able to handle that infection so that if it does ever encounter it naturally, then we already have the cells and the equipment, the antibodies, the memory B cells, and the memory T cells that can quickly form into helper T cells and cytotoxic T cells that can deal with the parasites, the viral parasites that have infected our cells. And we can also form those plasma B cells much faster that can deal with that specific antibody and mount a secondary immune response. So passive immunity results when a person receives a an injection of the antibodies for that particular pathogen, so against that particular antigen. So we can cause another person or an animal immune system to make these antibodies so that we can inject the specific antibodies required to fight that infection. But passive immunity has its disadvantages. It is short lived, so as soon as our body clears out those antibodies, it does not provoke the formation of memory B cells and T cells. It just gives that individual time for their immune system to respond to the infection. So, immunization is the administration of an antigen bearing vaccine designed to elicit immunity to specific diseases. And a vaccine is one way of getting active immunity, where you have a preparation that contains an antigen that elicits that primary immune response. Passive immunization is where you have an administration of the antibodies that would fight that particular antigen. But what this does is buy time for individuals to be able to rally their immune system and mount an immune response in certain diseases that sometimes work very quickly and are lethal diseases like and infections within the first couple of weeks of encountering that particular antigen. So in passive immunization, it's just an administration of antibodies, but there is no immune response provoked. So the vaccines, like the smallpox vaccine, has, for the most part, in many areas of the world, has wiped out a virus as bad as smallpox. Pox viruses are the largest of animal viruses and can be seen using a light microscope here. So here's a smallpox virus right here. They have double-stranded DNA in them. But because of the vaccine, we've virtually wiped out smallpox. So there are vaccines available against many of these microorganisms that can cause bad disease like pneumonia and polio and tetanus, whooping cough, measles, many other kinds of diseases. So because of our vaccinations, we can even develop herd immunity. So because of childhood vaccinations, we can we can control whether or not people are exposed to these bad pathogens and these viruses, so that if most people in a population are protected because they've had the vaccine, then it's much less likely that somebody who is immunocompromised or very old or very young would be exposed to that particular disease. One thing that helps us with passive immunity is that, of course, that can be conferred on us naturally. We receive our antibodies from our mother's blood that cross the placenta. We also receive antibodies during nursing when a baby nurses after birth. So that's a type of passive immunity that gives us a boost that comes directly from our mother for whatever antigens that she has dealt with in her lifetime. That passive immunity can be artificially conferred on a person, like I was talking about earlier, where you have an injection of antibodies if you have a disease that acts so quickly that the desire would be to try to buy time for the immune system to be able to build up its own response, like in cases when you have botulism or rabies or tetanus, when there's bacterial toxins that can cause paralysis and permanent and long-term damage or death, then we would be giving the injection of the antibodies. These injections are called gamma globulins injections. So here's a chart with some of the recommended immunizations. And then finally, a chart just indicating, primary immune response when our body is having to encounter that antigen on its own and really build up those forces versus secondary immune response when we have those memory B cells and memory T cells to deal with that particular infection. So thank you so much for joining me for this video lecture series on the immune system. Take care.